I don't know if my bio or quick CV is online at all and people signed up. But usually when I give any sort of talk or class, I give a very brief introduction because hopefully in one way or another, you're all researchers, so it's always good to know where the information is coming from. So if you cry BS on me, maybe you have sympathy knowing where I come from. I started out being kind of born into a family of teachers and academics, which I think I didn't realize that till later that might have had a good influence. Always loved to learn, always loved to read, still do. Never thought that art had anything to do with any sort of career, any viable career, certainly not in my family nor anybody I knew of. So went on into the sciences eventually, pre-med, chemistry, loved it. Didn't really like me all that much, the chemistry part. However, I started finding a love in art and studio arts. And of course then, being the history buff that I was, really jumped both feet into the art history. So I ended up getting a degree in pre-med and then jumping over, getting a master's degree in fine arts, focusing on metal. Because I figured of all the materials I wanted, that's probably the hardest to learn. So I studied a lot of bronze casting, which also led me to pursue some really interesting stuff in the Chinese traditional arts of bronze casting and doing some patination research, things like that. Bringing in teachers from other colleges to try to get us into the history. But at the same time, as I'm teaching and learning and then teaching, the big question that came up to me all the time, especially from studio artists, is about the market and about how things work, whether it's auction houses, why is this artist in a museum, why is this guy famous and this person's not, all that questions that sometimes we take for granted. And that of course led me on another path. So I went to pursue more information. I was getting tired of teaching at the point. So a colleague of mine at University of Michigan said, come on over to our program, sit in for a while, learn a little bit about some stuff and see what happens. So I was at U of M and got to work with a few incredible people over there and really delve into the contemporary market as well as some of the more traditional aspects of specifically Chinese art. Decided to go to China, got married at the time and then told my wife, I'm gonna go to China for a year. She's like, all right, I'm gonna go to Connecticut. Okay. No kids, so that worked out well. Went over to China and really, this was around 2005. So I was really in the thick of things with a lot of the contemporary artists. Those of you online can't see, but this place we're in is a lot of really incredible contemporary artwork, contemporary Chinese artwork. It's nice to see. Got to know a lot of the artists, got to know a lot of things, and spent like half of my time as well, not just with language studies, but also with spending my time in the dirt markets and looking at the antiquities at some of the museums which were kind of subpar, at least back then over there. Came back to New York, started to work in the business side. Worked in contemporary Chinese art as a gallerist, ran a gallery down in Tribeca. Later on, short version, ran another gallery that got to work with overseas and larger collectors, worked at ArtNet briefly as kind of getting their Chinese and Asian department up and hoping to breathe some life into their brand new Asian department there. And then from there went on to do some more business when it came to developing some online markets for like an internet marketplace for art, which involved a lot of contemporary stuff as well as antiquities, a lot of dealing with collectors, a lot of authentication, a lot of valuation. Throughout this whole time I was doing, since I came back to New York, I was doing a lot of consulting. I have friends who are buyers for museums. I have collector friends, artist friends, doing a lot of this consulting, doing a lot of advising, doing a lot of valuation, things I didn't actually realize would eventually become most of my career. So as it came down, I was doing more and more of these valuation services and more advising on things, not just contemporary works, but also in the antiquities. So I was helping a friend out who needed another appraiser. There is an appraisal company that's down south a little bit. So I started working for them, and as is now I work for 3 different appraisal companies as kind of a contractor, as well as teach, and still have my private clients. here and there, which usually end up being more friends than clients lately, unfortunately. And it allows me to have flexibility with family. So I come at it from both, I have an artist's background to some extent. I have the academic background and experience in the work, as well as a business perspective. So I know sometimes a lot of people who are interested in topics such as authenticity are often coming from more the academic perspective, or even the auction house type specialist perspective. But there is a business side to it too. And that's what I wanted to get into. So what is this class? What is this class? What is this talk? I'm used to teaching a class, sorry about that. It is not a comprehensive how-to guide to authenticate. If that were the case, this would be a much longer class and we charge a lot more money. And I would be sitting where you are and listening to somebody else. It is not a comprehensive guide. I will be giving some tips and tricks for specific pieces near the end for sure. But it's also not a course on scientific methodologies. Those are very important. I will introduce some, make you aware of them, but I'm not the authority on that. That's a totally different business. I believe we're looking for another type of course that more specifically delves into that. And I'm anxious myself. And what knowledge I do have in that is limited and possibly even totally wrong. So we have a scientist in the audience here, so she may cringe once in a while if I do mention something incorrect. Please speak up. This is not a primer on laws and consequences, because those often change quite a bit, and we have something else coming up with that as well, which I'm interested in taking. Unfortunately, when it comes to authentication for a collector, sometimes it's just a matter of suing the people. So there's not a lot of there's not all the laws protecting you. If the work is stolen, if the work is a customs or a restricted material or animal product, there's a lot of laws. If it's just fake, then that's something different. And this is not a USPAP appraising course. How many here have experience in appraising? Okay, a few people. Okay, good. I do come at it a lot from the appraisal side of things, because that's a lot of what I do, but coming from that approach, I think it's a very convenient approach and a very useful approach, because these issues that would affect everybody are very formally discussed issues in the appraising world. So I will bring up a lot of things about appraising and appraisals and specific situations that should help everybody. And it is not, of course, a discussion about the recent Da Vinci painting that just sold. We would all love that. So tonight I want to discuss some basic ideas of authenticity, what it actually means to the collectors, advisors, dealers, appraisers. I want to get into some of my personal rules of thumb and some warning signs, red flags, however you want to call them. One of my students was telling me there's a talk recently, I think it was called like 14 things to 14 ways or so many ways to know if a work of art is fake before you even see it, which is kind of funny. And I thought of that, and I don't know if I've totally 14 ways, but there are a lot of ways that can, a lot of things that can give you little red flags if you're going to a collector or looking at a work of art. And again, at the end, some tips and tricks to kind of help you out a little bit if you find yourself in a situation you might not be totally out of your element. Okay. What do we mean by authentic or authenticity? Usually people think of attribution. Is this by Wang Guangyi? Is this by the specific artist? Is this a Da Vinci? Or they think of age. Is this really from the Han Dynasty, or was this made in the 1980s? And those are very important. That's usually what's discussed. I like to take a broader approach to authenticity because it keeps, I think, all the dealings we do a little bit, it puts us in a safer place when we look at a broader scope of authenticity. So physically and non-physically, material can have a lot more impact on whether it's the value or the sale than others. For instance, gold. Something's gold, whether it's 14th century or whether it was made, in the 2000s, the material itself, knowing that it's really gold, can have a huge impact on value or on whatever else is going to be done with that work collection. That's clear. That's materials is very important. Something like ivory, also very important to know it's the right material. Not for such a positive reason. Sometimes the fact that you can know if something is ivory or not means you have to have an uncomfortable conversation with the owner and saying, beautiful work, I'm glad you enjoy it, don't try to sell it, or even put it in your pocket and walk across state lines, or really do anything with it. So that can have a huge impact. The authenticity of the material can have a huge impact on what you want to do with this work. Jade, which I realized I have a lot of examples about jade here, so bear with me. Maybe it'll be consistent. Jade is not something that's terribly difficult to authenticate the material. It's not really all that rare or uncommon as a material. And you can't really, I'll get into the age later, but the material itself, whether it's jade or not jade, may have less to do with the value than other factors. Other factors mostly being either provenance or most especially quality and craftsmanship. That could trump the authenticity of material. So proving that it's jade, I had a situation I may refer to again, where the client brought everything to the Gemological Institute to prove it was all jade. I said, you just wasted your money. I told you it was jade. It's fine. Nobody needs that definitive in his cases. So age, of course, is also very important for authenticity. I mentioned the Han Dynasty. It could look great. The style's right. Everything's correct. It's beautiful. It's an incredible representation of this specific period in Chinese history, but it was made 6 years ago. That could make a value of $30, literally $30 to $30,000. So age can be very, very important in certain cases, maybe not in others, like jade. People always say, how old is this jade? I say, well, it's possibly around 550 million years old, because it's stone. That's what jade is. You can't test it to see how old it is because it's a metamorphic rock, or I think it's metamorphic rock. So age is not necessarily important. That's done by connoisseurship. You'll see a lot of, actually I was just at the Met and they have a wonderful, I believe it's temporary, exhibition upstairs in one of the smaller rooms in the Asian gallery. And it's a one person's collection of jade. And it's pretty, very nice. I don't know if anybody had a chance to see it. Very nice, very comprehensive. But it's funny when you look at the dates and it's like 12th century to 20th century. It's a bit of a gap in there. We're not sure. So a lot of it is, the authenticity of age isn't necessarily the most important thing. It's important, but I get a lot of netsuke, the little Japanese, I don't know the word for it, but little ornaments, functional. They're not really functional anymore. And sometimes the most beautiful ones are recent ones. They look like they're old. So sometimes age isn't the most important thing. Porcelain, for instance, certain periods of Chinese history, there's incredible blue and white porcelain, and there were, literally giant ships full of this stuff. And there's a piece I just ran across. It's about, I think it's Ming, it's early Ming dynasty, beautiful piece, $400. Just the fact that it's really old doesn't necessarily mean it's super valuable. There's one that's hundreds of years more recent that can be a factor of 10 more valuable. So in certain cases, age isn't the main thing that you're looking for. Condition, of course, can be very important. Has a piece been repaired? Has a piece been damaged? If you're presented with the work either to do some sort of appraisal, to take it as collateral, to it's being donated to a museum, or you're a collector buying it with possibly the hopes of reselling it in the future, you need to know the history. Some pieces, of course, it's very understandable that there be damage or repair if it's an old piece of antiquity. Other pieces, especially contemporary work, it can have a huge effect on the value. I had worked with a piece, I walked away from it. And it was a a Warhol piece that a lot of people in the industry have seen this piece. It's kind of floating around. But I did a little bit of research. Actually, a former student of mine brought me in. I'll bring this up again when it comes to ownership. Brought me in because she felt she was over her head. She was asked to help sell this piece. And very little bit of research, I realized there not only was there a lot of other issues, but there was issues with repairs that weren't quite authorized repairs. And that, for the market, I don't think it really made any difference to the work itself. But for the market, that's a huge red mark. So knowing that stuff before going in, to me, I look at that as also authenticity. Yes, it was a Warhol. Yes, it was made at this time. Yes, it was owned by not really owned. But there was some condition history that made what was presented to me inauthentic. There's also, when it comes to antiquities, there's a lot of artificially distressed. Sometimes condition is expected. You get beautiful bronzes or furniture, a lot of furniture that's horribly distressed. And there's been a number of cases where there's been legitimately authentic early bronze pieces that, whether it's the person looting the tomb or whatever it was, or some unscrupulous dealer early on decided it didn't look authentic enough, so they abused it with chemicals and to try to fake a patina, and here they just, they ruined it. So be aware that sometimes these repairs are important, are necessary. Now, the ones we're more used to, I'll get into, I think, attribution later. Provenance, history, same thing. You're getting a work of art. Everything else seems to check out fine, whether or not you're asked to help sell it, have it for collateral, bring it to a museum, put it up at auction. A client may come to you if you find yourself in this position and say, I'd like to sell this, help me out with it. Let's put it up at auction, great. Give me all the information on it. Checked off all the boxes. Everything seems right. I forgot to ask, oh, by the way, do you actually own it? It sounds like a stupid question, but it's not. It's a very important question. And this has come up quite a bit. Case in point that I was just mentioning, I found out that the person offering this for sale was not the sole owner of this work. And it was under very hot contention. Another piece happened to be another Warhol. I was brought in, everything was checked out incredibly. It was really a fabulous piece. Very famous owner. And I had a client who was very potentially interested here in New York. Luckily, they're a friend of mine. Getting advanced into kind of the negotiation, and the client gives me a call and said, I think that piece is actually on view, a block from me. What are you talking about? It's supposed to be over in Greece. No, it's down the block. Turned out that the person, again, wasn't the only owner of the work. And it was, luckily it was a friend of mine who was the potential client. And it was more of a funny story to tell. It could have been a disaster. So make sure you know the owner. There's something that happens a lot. And I'm going to mention this because I think both from a collector and from somebody purchasing it at certain auction houses and a dealer, it's good to know. I was totally naive of this was even a possibility. I started working at ArtNet. Nothing against ArtNet, but the nature of kind of this online auction house, what had happened a number of times, specifically with one contact, and she had been quickly blackballed from ever submitting works for sale, was she would present a work, and it looks great, this, boom, 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 great, we can put up on sale. Now, of course, at ArtNet, it's a little bit changed recently, but in ArtNet, nothing, we saw no work of art physically. Everything happened off-site for tax and insurance reasons. It made sense. So her plan was, and I'm sure it worked because she had been giving stuff for quite a while, and may not have been every single piece she handled, but she would offer a piece at ArtNet, up at sale, probably other auctions as well. Then that piece would sell. If it would sell, then she'd quickly turn around to the person who actually owned the piece and buy it, and then handle the transaction. But that's incredibly risky, obviously. And she got snagged quite a bit when all of a sudden she would pull things at the last minute from a sale, or when you would have a successful bidder and they would. So I would start doing things like, and sometimes I've done this ever since then, if somebody presents me a painting that photograph might look a little too nice, or it might look like it came screen grab or something like that, which it may be, you know. It's amazing how many clients, it's so hard for them to take a photograph, go in their living room and take a photograph, or the piece is in storage. It's a $500,000 piece. Go to storage and take a photograph of it. It's worth it for you. Send somebody out there. You know, so I'll get these images and I'll say, oh, you know, it's just, I have a client interested, but he wants to see the photograph of the back of it. Could you send a photograph of the back? It's a new policy. I'd make up some story. And then if the line goes dead, I know that they probably don't have the piece. Maybe they don't own it. Maybe they don't have the rights to sell it. Maybe they don't have access to it. Maybe they do own it, but it's in some storage overseas. And if you try to make a deal, you know, so whatever is the situation, what's presented to you is not authentic. The situation is not authentic. So be aware of that. Provenance, history, of course, that lumps in, is this a piece from China or is this actually a piece from Japan? There's some very early porcelain, not porcelain, it's like proto porcelain in China that looks almost identical to much later works coming from Japan. Even some experts are fooled. Things like that may not have a huge importance, but, or was this actually in the collection of this famous gentleman? As we'll see, sometimes the provenance who owns a work might have a lot more impact on the value or the marketability of a piece, even if there's doubts about its authenticity. The fact that this person owned it may be enough. So make sure you know the provenance and history. Don't take things for granted. Yes? We have a question.
How or what's the most effective way to clarify the provenance?
That's a very good question. And I wish I had one answer, but a lot of it is literally making phone calls, checking up. I'll give you some tips and tricks later on, some red flags that there may be an issue. Of course, if there's gaps, if they do present you with an incredible provenance, everybody knows any work that goes through Europe of a specific type, and there's a strange gap, say around mid-late 30s, you have to tread very carefully. And there are databases for stolen art or confiscated art. There are foundations sometimes, not just attribution, but who might have information on who owned it, things like that. That is a little trickier. Sometimes it's as simple as, I had a client to present something to me, and I really think it was not their fault. It was, they either were misunderstood when they originally purchased it, or were lied to when they purchased it. That this piece was in this big museum exhibition, like, you know, back in like the late 70s. And I went and did some research and turned out a very similar piece was in there, but not that piece. So it didn't really have an effect on what we needed to do with that work, but that was it. We had to change the provenance. We had to change the whole history of the work in a sense. And I use provenance and history as kind of a loose way. So the story behind the work, is that true? Every day I get stuff, I have no paperwork. My uncle used to travel in China back in the early 80s, and he brought a bunch of stuff back. I have no idea. And they're often honest, they just don't know. And then it's almost impossible to find provenance. So the last one, seemingly easiest, is attribution. Contemporary works, we look at something like Da Vinci, recent thing that sells, and there's a debacle, whether it's true or not, or partially him, or 20% of Da Vinci. Those cases make the headlines. Other things, you know, you could easily call a gallery. You could easily, if the artist is still alive, you know, you've sent things to artists. Do you remember this work? Especially if it's a regional artist, and they're usually wonderful at answering you because they want, you know, hopefully especially if they're not a famous artist, they want to maybe sell some more. And of course, I never tell them yet. The client wants to know because he wants to unload it, he wants to dump it. You know, say, oh, and it's for insurance reasons or something, you know, whatever. But sometimes that could be relatively easy to tell. But you can't assume, of course, just because it's a contemporary artist that's well known, especially in a multiple, like a print, a photograph, a Zhang Dali photograph, which is, again, those online. Sorry, you can't see his beautiful photograph in the back by the artist Zhang Dali.
I know him personally.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. I was telling a story about him earlier, but or about me and his work actually. But that's an interesting case too, Zhang Dali. Not only there, when we work with both Dali and a few other artists, contemporary Chinese artists who worked in photographs, we would often get uneditioned copies to sell or not to sell, to display, etc. And then sometimes we'd have them send, client would like it, they buy it, blah, blah, blah. But some of those unnumbered, unofficial editions find their way in the marketplace, and when they shouldn't. So sometimes just because it's a Zhang Dali photograph, the size is right, you have to make sure that it's actually a legitimate piece. Zhang Dali, for a while, a gallery I worked at, we had specific rights to sell, I think it was his neon or something like that. No, I think Eli Klein had the specific rights to sell just the neon, and somebody else had the specific rights to sell this. It was a little confusing. So that goes back to ownership and rights. Make sure it can get complicated. Sometimes it's very easy. I was at a client's house. Some of you may have been in a similar situation. Very nice, mostly memorabilia, a wealthy client, collected a lot of things, but they're kind of excited at the end of the day to show me their work that they were kind of excited about. And there were a lot of red flags to begin with. And, a mysterious little Henry Moore bronze sculpture, which did not look correct, and a bunch of other odd things, and some Dali prints and things. And then there was, at first glance, the first one I saw of this little extra collection was a Mary Cassatt little drawing. I don't see them very much. It's beautiful, little simple, kind of sketch, unfinished. And I looked, and usually the drawings I have seen, it's like, if there's a signature at all, it's like MC or something in pencil. It's really kind of afterthought. This one was very specific, M. Cassatt. Slightly different type of pencil. It's not necessarily definitive. And then, of course, took a double take, and it was spelled incorrectly. So, the person took the time to really nail home that this attribution spelled the name wrong. And of course, the back had one of these wonderful gallery tags, which also had numerous spelling errors. So luckily, they were kind of aware that there were some problems, but they didn't want to bias it. So, and they were really, really nice about it. But sometimes that can be tricky. Sometimes it can be a little more difficult. This is a funny example. This is a very famous performance back in the early days of contemporary Chinese art, when it was more about the performance and there was no market, really. Nobody was buying stuff. Well, around this time, 1995. It's called, I think I kind of abbreviated. I think it's like Add 12 Square Meters to an Anonymous Mountain, I think is the full title. There's a couple in this kind of series. Zhang Huan, artist at the bottom, but there's a whole story behind it I'm not going to get into for sake of time. He kind of grabbed this idea, and without telling all the other artists, he kind of ran with it, and he started doing all the other, raised the level of a pond and all that stuff. But this is a bunch of artists, and they're all involved, some friends, 10 artists, I think other people with cameras, whatever. So when the market became really hot, who owns the photographs? Well, they all kind of do, So you'll have Zhang Huan and Zhu Ming, which is an incredible artist, not as well known, unfortunately. Not Zhu Ming is the sculptor. Zhu Ming spelled differently, performance artist. And I actually sold both of these within a few months of each other. And Zhang Huan was almost twice as expensive. However, if you're presented with something and you have a rudimentary knowledge of contemporary Chinese art, you would see this image and say, Zhang Huan, this is very hot, he's a hot artist, blah, 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 all this stuff. You would, all 8 cylinders down the road, and you might never check that it's actually his work. Yes?
So was there some kind of like a formal acknowledgement that one edition of prints was to be attributed to Zhang Huan, the other one not?
It's China, so who knows? But we worked it with both artists, and they each have their own records, and they participated in the event. Actually, a lot of Rong Rong and his wife Inri, but Rong Rong did a lot of photographs of Zhang Huan, and you can find images both of some of the performances he did in the East Village back in China, and both would be selling them. So it's kind of, I think back at the time they called it the Wild Wild East. Somebody called it, and it's kind of a catch as catch can. But it's good to know that there may be other artists attributed to the same work legitimately. These are both totally authentic. This is not an authentic Zhang Huan. This one is.
But why?
because that's the artist made a specific edition
see.
of
Okay.
this work. So, okay, that might be what you're asking. Yes, there were some records that he had this edition,
Okay.
but of course,
Oh, sorry, is it with signature or any kind of records on?
there were some signatures and there was some documentation, but a lot of it, of course, is just, luckily we were the authority on that, so we could say, we have this and we have this. But, so that's, sometimes it can be a little tricky. I wanted to, okay, with some of those general things out of the way, some of the general definitions of things that I look for when I talk about authenticity. It's not just, is this a Mary Cassatt? Is this older than 100 years old? I look at the whole picture, because we can focus too much on authenticity without, and we miss some of the major things. So, but it is a scary word. And authenticity, the one thing I want to talk about today is authenticity is not often an exact science. Even when you're using science, as we'll look into, it's not an exact science. So there are a great many cases when it's very hard to be actually sure if something is authentic or not authentic. So I look at it as degrees of authenticity or degrees of certainty. So know that going into it. Why is authenticity important? Anybody?
To be sure that you own a unique thing.
Right, to be sure, ownership. So you know that you own something that's what you think it is. Right.
Influences the price.
Value. But the thing, yeah.
To make sure you're selling Modigliani and not at Lori.
Right, exactly, yeah. I ask this question because this is something that you often have to ask yourself when dealing with a specific work or collection, or you have to ask the person who owns it. Why is authenticity important? Sometimes it's just for, and I've seen this, you've all seen probably some Antiques Roadshow. If you haven't, they have a lot of them on PBS on the computer. They're really funny. Sometimes you get those older folks and they bring up something and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was worth $10,000. Oh, I have no desire to sell it. I just was curious. And I believe about 10% of those, but there are people who they just want to know, oh, that's nice. Here we have this on our mantle. Now I'll make sure the kids don't eat cereal out of it, but I'm not going to sell it. So authenticity to them is really only important because of more of the story, I said provenance, but more of the, just the knowledge of what it is. The information is more important. It could be just proper cataloging for, say, a museum, even if a work isn't necessarily valuable, or maybe a museum is not permitted to sell certain things. Sometimes authenticity is only important for proper cataloging. And if there's mistakes in authenticity at some museums or some institutions, it's simple as just changing the tag. Whoops, academics, scientists were wrong, no big deal, change the tag. Where it becomes often very important and the most tricky is when it comes to money, when it comes to the value. I don't always like to focus on money. I do that in my art market courses, and it can get, I think, tedious sometimes. But most of the things we talked about ownership, or do I own the work? Is this really what it is? Often when you have those questions, it's because they want to know the value of it, whether it's for insurance or resale or estate purposes. You said, am I selling the right work? I could sell you what you think is a Modigliani, and then 10 years down the line, I get a knock on my door and with some questions. And that could be expensive, both reputation as well as financially. So it usually is, when we talk about authenticity, it usually does kind of go back to money in some ways. And that's an important issue, which I'll bring up a little bit later as to why that is important specifically and how you can get around necessarily the issues of authenticity because it's about money, how you can get around that. So, so where does this leave us? It's not an exact science. There's lots of different types of authenticity we have to worry about. Sometimes we can't know everything. So I think I'm gonna, this should be my most recent, so I think the next slide. So anyways, appraisers. I'm again using that as an example. Not all of you are appraisers or have that information, but because this is something where there are actually certain codes and certain types of rules set up by the Congress a number of years ago, and to kind of regulate how an appraisal happens. I wouldn't say they're laws, but there are certain guidelines. They're called a USPAP. I can never remember what, taken the class for 10 years.
Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice.
That's
Perfect, there you go, USPAP. And a USPAP sounds like a medical thing I have to.
Oh yeah, you
I
have to get regularly USPAP'd.
Exactly, yes. And no matter how many years I take it, I always forget what the heck it stands for. Anyways, there is they talk about authenticity. And for years, appraisers have always raised the red flag saying, or white flag, I guess, saying, appraisers are not authenticators. We're not responsible for saying this is authentic or not, which is always kind of a little bit dubious, because if I'm appraising a Qianlong porcelain piece, and if I give it a value of $80,000, I'm saying it's authentic. If I get a value of $150, I'm saying it's not authentic. So I am responsible for understanding the authenticity. So it's kind of a weird, well, you're not, but if you get it wrong, then you're responsible. Wonderful interaction with government. Similar with ivory sometimes. So the Appraiser Foundation, which is actually kind of an organization connected to, they're the ones who put together some of these guidelines for appraisals. They're a group of experts in various fields, and they kind of write regulations. This is their specific guideline, and it's verification. This is about authenticity. Verification by an authorized, qualified person that a fine or decorative art object or antique was produced by a certain person. I kind of bolded it doesn't really see. Or was produced in a certain place or period of history. They're looking primarily for that, which is fine. That's most of what we deal with. Generally, appraisers are not authenticators. And unless they have an area of expertise in research and publication in a particular field of fine art, decorative art, antiques, et cetera, an outside expert is required to resolve issues of authenticity. Great, cut and dry, perfect. We just get an outside expert. Where? Who are they? That can be very, very difficult. I'm going to skip ahead because I don't. Okay. So what does that mean? Due diligence. Great. It's like when your child says, well, why don't we just do what I say? I don't have a reason for it. Here it is, just because it's good for you. It builds character. Things that we can't really explain. Due diligence is the word. And that's good. That makes sense. That gives us a little bit of latitude. It's very important because at least they're recognizing that in many situations, the authenticity cannot be determined. So as long as you can show that you did your work, and this is for everything. If you're a seller, if you're a collector, or I'm sorry, you're a dealer, or you're selling, say, at auction as a private person, or you are doing research for say, artwork as collateral, then as long as you can prove you did your due diligence and there's not huge neglect on your part, then usually you can kind of sleep well at night. Not always, but usually you can kind of sleep well at night. So do your due diligence. So 3 things I try to focus on. Know what you can know. Again, as an appraiser or as an advisor, or like I said, sometimes I would get a call from a friend of mine who buys for the Met, and I'll get literally something on my phone with a picture. What do you think? Is this good? I'm like, I'm getting on a train. I can't, I don't know. But know what you can know. So before I go to a client's house, a lot of what I do is I have to go to a client's house, and whether it's for estate purposes or insurance, first I find out what I'm looking at ahead of time. And I know as much as possible. I try to get as much information as possible about what I'm expected to see. And I get as much information as possible about the owner or the collector or the business, whoever is I'm dealing with. I'm often doing a lot of research on the train, going in, finding dates, finding names, things that I'm not entirely an expert on, which none of us are experts on everything, of course. Let's skip ahead here. And when you're there, take lots
and lots of photos and documentation. Whether, again, you're in an appraisal situation or you're in another situation, sometimes you're asked to make a comment on authenticity, but you don't have a very limited association with the work, time or whatever. So you have to take so many. There's only so much you can do. Limited time with the owner of the work, asking questions, getting documentation. Limited time photographing. Many times yes.
I just wanted to make a comment
Sure.
to be very careful about what you say when you're in an owner's home.
Yes.
I walked into a room, flew all the way to Basel to look at this painting, walked into a room and said, wow, because when I saw the painting up close, I realized it was a painting that was already hanging on the wall in the Rijksmuseum. And the owner was walking around telling all these investors that were there that had already invested in this work. She said, wow, that means that it's good. And that's not an offer.
Right. That is a very good point. Very good point. I make it, and more so because I'm an appraiser. I wear that hat at times, but I make it very careful not to make any sort of statement about authenticity, especially authenticity, value, or anything other than like, that's really, I really like that, or whatever it is. That's very interesting. Tell me more. Ask a lot of questions. If you don't know, sometimes I'll say, when you bought that, what did they tell you it was? Sounds like I know more than they do, and I might not. I might have no idea what that is. But yes, be very careful. And there's situations I might get into later where it was actually enjoyable because I had information, but it was a whole scam that their guy was trying to perpetrate, and I had to be very careful what I was saying. So anyways, take lots and lots and lots of photographs. Many times I've been in situations where I've days later when I'm doing actual research on a piece, I discover, oh, there's a specific way to really definitely know cataloging information or even authenticity. Maybe it's the way a chair is constructed or a dovetail of a piece of furniture. And I look back, oh, thank goodness I took a photograph of that. And there are a lot of times when I get photographs that are not sufficient enough. And I realize, if only I took a photograph of the handle, I would now save myself hours and hours of time and phone calls to the client. If you're getting pictures taken for you or getting information, know what to ask. Do your research. I don't know how many times I get these, tons of export porcelain or Chinese porcelain with no photographs of the rims or the bottoms or the close. It's all big blurry things on high shelves. Like, I feel bad. I can't do anything about that. So ask questions. Has this been cataloged before? Where did they get it? Is there any paperwork at all? Any family stories, any legends, any anecdotes? Everything is a data point. And I often tell clients, everything you can give me is going to help you. So, and if it has a direct relationship to the value, that kind of gets them going. Oh, yeah, okay, now I'll find that. Oh, I don't know where that receipt is. Well, here's the value without the receipt, or here's the value without that TL test. Oh, hold on a minute. 20 minutes later, they found it. So, and then also seek advice. Oh, sorry, here we go. Know what you don't know. Again, the gaps in information. I can tell you everything about this piece, the material, all this stuff. I don't know, do I know actually who the owner is? Things like that. Do I know that the history of this piece? Do I know if there's been any repairs done? Know what you can't know going into it. And again, that's going back to knowing how to ask the right questions. There could be gaps in information. Find out where to get that information. Make friends in the art world. I have friends who are archaeologists, one in Asia, one in South America, and sometimes I'll send him information. Is this really what it is? Is this really, such and such period, such and such? And he'd be like, yes, that looks exactly right. However, you can buy them for $5 by the hundreds on the streets in Costa Rica. Good to know, Where did you buy this, by the way? Costa Rica. Oh, okay. That can help. So get information. And there's one thing I do want to talk about very briefly. I put it up here for those of you who maybe you take a picture or something or just writing things down. There are a lot of scientific tests. There are a lot of tests you can do. I'm not getting into that right now. Again, find out all you can about, Google is a wonderful thing. Find out all you can about something before you see it. Using a UV light Can that help tell if a piece is repaired or varnish on a painting? Things like that. That's fine. You can do that. You know, have a little kit if you need to. But then there are other things that are maybe beyond you. Not that you have to necessarily be responsible for arranging these things or even responsible for knowing them all, but there are a few that it's good if you're ever in a situation to at least know that there is a way perhaps to answer this question. If I didn't know how to definitively test the age of something, and I don't tell the client that, or I don't, you know, do their research ahead of time, I don't ask a gallery or a dealer, has this been TL tested? Has it been thermoluminescence tested? Then I might find myself in some trouble when it comes to authenticity. Spectroscopy, they use a lot of gemstones, other things. It's kind of a light diffraction, and that's actually pretty simple. You can buy a little hand. Then there's different types of spectroscopy, which are a little more complicated. You wouldn't probably have one, but you can tell certainly if something is type of jade or another type of stone. Even coral, you could use this sometimes if you need to. There's different infrared spectrometry. Again, it has to do with material, finding material, scanning and transmission electron microscopy. Very, very detailed finds, sometimes used in determining what types of things are going on in metal or even with sculpture. Yes?
I would say probably the main reason that we use scanning electron microscopy to study objects of art is literally looking at the layer structure of a painting and the mixture of pigments to say, okay, we know that Rembrandt used these types of grounds, because a lot of times people that fake and forge objects of art, they'll get the surface layers correct, but the preparation layers they'll get wrong. And so often it's really great to get the preparation layers studied.
Yeah, exactly. As I was saying, in painting sometimes, again, different layers, and even in bronze, when you're looking at layers of patina, or even in ceramics, sometimes you're looking, if you have an area, you could look at the layers of glazing. That can be really, really important. That's a detail you don't need to know. Okay. X-rays, actually use this a lot in bronze, but you can X-ray lots of things. You've seen this where like they found, recently they found the skeleton of an actual monk inside of a Buddha. It's kind of creepy.
Wow.
Yeah. However, you know, there's some really interesting things, and I'll show you something later that I don't think it was normal X-ray. Yeah, I actually think it was normal X-ray, but then they color enhanced it, where that really proved something that another test didn't miss. There's CAT scans, literally stuff that, you know, medical. We hear a lot about carbon-14 testing. That's really only good for organic material, and it's good for like 50,000 years or something. I forget what the
80,000.
80,000. Okay. Thermoluminescence testing, I see a lot, and I have to deal with a lot. That's really for certain types of ceramic. It's really good for porcelain, but it's more used on, say, earlier like terracotta, and that's a way, not to get into details, that's a way to tell age. But there are tricks. Solvent testing, sometimes you can find out, like proper materials, you can find out what type of solvent they might have, or what type of adhesive they might have used, or what type of repair was done, or what type of pigment. Many different things. Sometimes if you see solvent tested, blah, 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 you'll know that that's a way, again, to test authenticity. And then DNA testing. And it's not like, yeah, Rembrandt had a hair, you know, stuck to his painting. But usually I only see this when it comes to restricted animal products, like is it elephant DNA, is it elephant ivory, is it mammoth ivory, is it walrus, things like that. I somewhat unknowingly smuggled, I don't know, I carried on my back python skin erhu back from China, you know, and I found out later that back then, at least, it was considered restricted. I don't think anymore it is. I don't know. They're in farms everywhere. So anyway, the last one is know when you can't know. Know when you're beat. Know when there's no way to know if this actually, you can't definitively prove that this something is authentic or not. And this is where I look at degrees of authenticity. I know we're probably running a little late already, aren't we? But anyways, there's a lot more stuff I want to talk about, so I'll go a little quick. Again, sometimes you can't know. Again, with jade, there's really no scientific testings. Yeah, I can test it's jade, and I can test that it's super old. Sometimes you can tell with how it was worked or tool work. Sometimes you can tell with really old jade. There are some surface things that happen because of advanced age and being buried, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you just can't know. Sometimes even with thermoluminescence testing, there can be tricks that people can fool you with. Sometimes you can't figure out the history where it's from. I have an incredible piece. It's this weird saddle camel piece. I believe it fit on top of a camel, probably the early 1900s, late 1800s, Egypt area. And I mean, I sent things to the Met. I contacted Bedouin museums, which some are no longer there, in Egypt and the Middle East. I talked to specialists all over the country. Nobody can figure out. They said, it's really awesome looking, but nobody can figure out exactly. There's no other example. Luckily, the client it was just their grandmothers. They really wanted to know what it was. They're going to donate it, but they would like to know what it is. So it was okay. We couldn't know. Sometimes it's not a cost effective to test. Maybe you can know. I could get this thing tested. I can get a thermoluminescence testing, but the client's like, I don't want to pay the money, or we don't have time. We have to have this resolved now. Sometimes the limiting factor, you can't know, and that's okay. Well, it's not great, but it's okay. Sometimes for contemporary art, there's the foundations that are either dissolved, they're no longer around, or they're so problematic to deal with. I'm thinking of the other Juming, J-U-M-I-N-G, sculptor in Taiwan. A lot of issues now with fakes, so it's very problematic to get something authenticated over there. And sometimes people just say, forget it. I'll just throw it up. I have a lot of examples I'm thinking I'm going to skip. And we're the experts. How do you go to an expert? Well, I'll go to the Met. I'll ask the painting department, the Chinese painting department in the Met. And they can't hang up the phone faster. I mean, there was a big debacle years ago, the riverbank painting, supposedly by Dong Yuan. And well, I have a book, I think I lent it to a student and it's disappeared, but all about this issues of authenticity. And now, at least at the Met and many other museums, they are forbidden to have anything, any comment publicly, privately, cocktail party, to say anything about authenticity or value or anything, because they don't want it to come back and bite them, which is a shame, because often they are the best experts and you can't really, sometimes if you befriend them on occasion, or like, a particular museum owes you money for a job you did, they might bend the rules a little bit and give you an off the record a bit of opinion, but you can't go there. That may be a limiting factor. That may be the only way, and that's not there. So you can't know. So maybe nobody can know. What do? Do you walk away? So anybody who has taken this USPAP course, especially through the AAA with Gail, you get given all these scenarios. And the answer to almost every single scenario is, well, you recuse yourself and you walk away, which is great, except then you never ever get paid. You don't have a job, and you can't really call yourself an appraiser if you don't do anything. So sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to make a decision. So sometimes it's better to walk away, though. I will say in specific situations, it's better to lose a client or to lose a deal than to lose reputation or a huge financial loss. But in most cases, it's better to have the short loss than the loss of your reputation, especially those of us who are looking to be as a career for this. So again, real quickly, degrees of authenticity. Insurance, sometimes that's the most flexible. If you're doing kind of an insurance appraisal or something for insurance, it's retail. So if the person bought it, that it was under the assumption it was authentic and a certain value, and they need to replace that, there's some leeway there. You may not be able to check all the boxes to prove it's authentic, but you're okay. However, be aware that insurance companies are perfectly willing to let you pay premiums on something for a number of years, but then as soon as there is damage or you need to replace it, then they may like, oh, wait a minute, let's look at that again. And I see this with ivory. A lot of insurance companies like, sure, we'll insure your ivory. And when it comes to replace it, yeah, well, we can't replace it. Sorry, thanks for the premiums that you've been paying all these years. So be careful and let your client know. That's a case where, do you need to know authenticity? Do you need to get for the ivory? It's a long story. I'll get into it. But there are some ways around it, but never good ways. It's unfortunate. It's kind of a loss, but they'll value it, or they'll insure it for you. Basically, just do your due diligence when it comes to comparables, visually good comparables, things that look very similar. You feel it's right, but always be open and honest. Both with the depending on who you're working with, the insurance company for sure, but also your client or yourself. Be honest. When it comes to estates, sometimes that can be tricky if the estate is just for tax reasons. Usually you err on the side of as low as possible because you don't have to pay a whole lot of money. But if that estate is being distributed between, say, contentious family members, you have to be really, really sure. A quick story, went to a place, a very prominent family, very big collectors, very wealthy. I got part of the story, I pieced it together. One of the daughters decided she would kind of let one of the other family members have this house and she'd have this house. Even though this house was crappy art, because she remembers a Picasso growing up, hanging in the office. And, make sure you check the office, make sure that I wanted extra pictures, documentation, blah, 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 whatever you need, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Get there, gonna go see this Picasso. Go in, and about 10 seconds, I realized it was a poster that had been cut down. And I had to call on somebody else. I'm like, what's, luckily was there another appraiser? Yeah, that's, and I found the actual poster. They'd cut it nicely and framed it beautifully. So my first thought was, well, maybe they do own it and it's in a vault somewhere. No, the woman just, misremembered or didn't know. And it was not a happy conversation. Luckily I was being hired by a company, so I didn't have to have that conversation directly. But you have to be very careful with that. It can be that can be really contentious when it comes to knowing authenticity, especially when there's a dissolution of funds. When it comes to simply just taxes, it's going to the great-grandson and he just doesn't, there's really no proof that this is really Han Dynasty. So I'm going to appraise it as if it were questionable, and therefore it's going to be lower and you pay less taxes, as long as you can verify it. As long as you can justify it, everything's honest, everything's above board. It's all about the narrative. Donation, sometimes it's a little bit on the higher end. You get a lot of, I think this should be worth $800,000. No, it's not. Again, be open and honest, especially if it's going to a museum. Make sure, this happened a few times, if you're approached with somebody to help out with a donation, make sure that the place they're donating it to actually knows that they're getting it. That happens a lot. Oh, yeah, well, I got all the forms to donate it. Did they look at it? Well, no, it's not the goodwill. You don't just drop it off and take your tax break. And sometimes even if they're giving it to a museum, make sure the person in the museum, that specific curator, sees it. They may be like, no, I don't think so. That may make your job easier. You don't have to worry about authenticating because they kind of did your job for you in a sense. So be aware of that. If they get the informational appraisals or they just ask you for your information about it, almost always it has to do with money. They want to sell it or they want to insure it, but usually they just want to sell it or collateral, something like that. That can be the most tricky. Find out everything you can. Find out why they want this. And this is where the market can help you. But ultimately, who decides authenticity? There's really only three major people who decide authenticity. I'm not counting the artists, which can be. It's going to be science can decide authenticity. Usually a pretty good degree of certainty, sometimes not always. When it comes to age, material, things like that. Often it's a specialist, whether it's an appraiser or a dealer, that can decide, especially when it's more connoisseurship and history and that type of research. But quite often, it is the market that decides authenticity. Is that, as if the academic side of me cringes, the business side of me says like, well, of course, obviously. Sometimes the market decides authenticity. It's not what we like. In a good way, that situation where somebody wants me to appraise something for authenticity, for information. I sit down and have a talk with them. A cup of coffee, glass of beer, whatever. Sit down, have a talk with them, find out what they really want to do is sell it. Then I change the topic. I say, listen, why are you worrying about this? I know people at these different auction houses or these different whatever. How about I work with you to try to sell it?
and I'll just take a percentage of whatever the thing is. And that way, because whether or not I say it's authentic, auction house maybe have a different opinion. Or maybe I don't think it's authentic, but the auction house, they might disagree and you might lose money. So why don't we just go right to the final step and see what happens, and often that can be more profitable for the poor appraisers who are always underpaid. In that situation, then you kind of let, in a sense, the market decide. But what market? It's a situation where, a smaller auction house, if they put up a Qianlong piece of ceramic, that's some questions to it, we'll let the market decide. Well, that smaller auction house, people will look at it and be like, well, if it were really confident in it, it would probably be at Sotheby's or Christie's or Bonhams or Guardian or something like that. So maybe it's fake. That exact same piece with the exact same catalog, exact same everything, same photographs, Sotheby's, Christie's, Bonhams, etc. It might get sky high because of that market. The brand has really helped decide the question of authenticity. May not be a definitive answer, but the market can kind of decide. And sometimes auction sales may be the only record of a piece. I forget, I think I said it in one of my classes. I forget who actually made the quote, and I'm paraphrasing it and butchering it, but it was a lament. I think it was that art used to have value when it was created. Painter in a studio. I made this, it has value. Now it only has value when it's first sold. So unless we get a record of how much somebody paid for it, value is pointless. A little depressing, a little sad, but sometimes it is true. So if a thing is somewhat questionable, but an auction house sells it, somebody buys it, then depending on what's going to happen with the piece, it can be considered authentic in the market. It's not pure, it's not proper necessarily, but again, what's the purpose of establishing authenticity? You have to continue to ask yourself that and ask your clients that. Sometimes that's all it is. There are a lot of, I could get into very specific and sometimes interesting and humorous details, but I do want to move on about how the market has decided. Again, some markets too, you have to be aware of where authenticity is less important than another factor. I have clients who would much rather have and pay dubiously high prices for specific Neolithic pottery that they know is probably not real, but the condition is really beautiful. The aesthetics are perfect. It's a great, they're okay with the fact that it may or may not be authentic. They're fine with that. There are other places, especially in Asia, where even if the authenticity or the attribution is in question, the provenance might dispel any worries that they have. Even if they know it's disputed, it was owned by this specific person, or this painter owned this, or this official, was photographed next to it, whatever it was. Sometimes the provenance is the most important thing. When you go to auction, sometimes I'll sell work in Asia, and other times I'll choose to sell it in the United States or Europe because people are looking for different things. So if it's weak on authenticity or attribution, but strong on provenance, I'll go somewhere else. If the condition's really bad, but the authenticity and everything's good, I'll go somewhere else. The condition's great, authenticity. You have to know where to go, know how to let the market decide, in a sense, the authenticity. Okay, so I'm skipping ahead a little bit because I want to get into some more of the fun things. Definitely open and honest communication. That's the main thing you need to do with everybody involved. And especially if you're working with this is the next slide. My daughter came in when I was putting this together, and she's like, "What does that mean, Daddy?" I'm like, "I'll tell you later." Yeah, CYA. Cover your behind. Protect yourself. Talk about you walking into somebody's house and saying, "Wow," right? Sometimes that's tricky, and people have gotten in trouble for cocktail party conversations. So always have communications with whoever you're dealing with. If you have a phone call, send them an email afterward. Hey, just want to recap what we're saying, and get a record of it. If you're working for a company, say you're doing some sort of appraising for them or whatever, do they have their own errors and omissions insurance, which is something appraisers
know about or hate because it's incredibly expensive and doesn't really do much for you. Are you covered for mistakes? Make sure everything is, and make sure that your client knows your concerns, your questions, and make sure they know what you want them to do. Maybe you can suggest that they get it tested. They're not willing to do it. You have it on record that you suggested that. If it ever goes to court, you say, how come you did? Well, I told the client this and this and this. You know, my job is done. So make sure you cover yourself. Now, some red flags. Especially if you're new to the business, whether it's a loan business or an appraisal business or kind of a broker dealer business, ask why me. I have I've one in particular situation where a student came to me and said, can you help me with this? It's an incredible piece, way over my head. I don't know why they asked me to do this. That's a good question. Why do they ask you when there's 100 people far more experienced? Nothing against her. And of course, that was one of the ones that was a huge nest of troubles with ownership, and it's a disaster. Ask yourself, why them? Why does this person have this work? They have a great collection of, Hummel figurines, and then a $200,000, Ming beautiful piece of porcelain. That doesn't make any sense, Are they a dealer themselves? Do they happen to have nothing but eBay collectibles, and then they have supposedly an original Chibai shirt that they got while they were traveling in Hong Kong? Why them? Does this make sense? Find out. I always ask, I'll get 3 or 4 items from a company, and they'll say, we're doing this huge appraisal. Can you look at these? I say, what's the rest of the stuff? If everything else is, crappy furniture and Dali prints off a cruise ship, I'll know how to approach these a little more skeptically. Mm-hmm. Not that these red flags will definitively tell you anything, but they can help you get out of trouble. Mm-hmm. Selective amnesia or convenient disasters. They can sit there and tell you for hours every single piece of flatware, where it came from in this great Venice glass factory that they visited. What about this giant 8-foot stone Buddha that, you had shipped and insured and blah, blah. I don't remember where we bought that. I think it was somewhere in France. I don't remember. Red flag, right? There's going to be things that you have to, interesting. Get to know who you're dealing with. Also, selective or convenient disasters. We had a fire. I can't find that receipt. I have receipt for everything else, but I can't find that. Things like that. I mean, that's an extreme example. Or things that are destroyed, and you're doing a lot of appraisals for insurance, and you realize, I found out that this is the 4th or 5th insurance claim this person has made in the past, 6 years. I need to find out who, why them. Is the owner an expert? We've all probably been there. One guy in particular, he wants to value his jade because it's damaged. And he sends me this 3-page email. Well, I was actually sent to the insurance company that then he forwarded on to me. And 98% of the email was probably copied off of Wikipedia, explaining how amazing the material of jade and its mythical qualities and this, and then how amazing he presenting himself as a prominent collector, an expert collector. That's a red flag, because there's no information about the actual work, which is a whole long story. Be aware that when they become this expert, and usually that can also find selective amnesia. I'm an expert on this subject, but I don't remember where I bought this. This is what you love doing.
Yeah, when it comes to our inquiries, I sometimes find that less is more.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Got this. I don't know what it is. Great. Perfect. I would rather deal with you. Also sometimes when they find comparables to help you out. Oh, here, could you value this painting? I found look at the sale last year. Oh, you mean the sale because that piece was formerly hung in the Louvre, and had this provenance and is 8 feet larger than yours? Thanks for the help. I appreciate it. And then they may be innocent. They're not trying to sway you, but they could be trying to sway you a little bit. So that's a red flag. Be aware when they want to be too involved in certain processes. Where do they purchase it? The joke was, if it's purchased on a cruise ship,
and you just smile, you know, and kind of walk away. Now, the talk I had mentioned before that a student of mine went to, I think he said that if they purchased it at an antique dealer in Florida, that's the new cruise ship, you know. Oh, great. You know, let me write down that information on my shoe and walk around. So know where they purchased it, or know if they didn't know where they purchased it. Sometimes that can really help if you see a gallery sticker on there that it's a very prominent name, or they purchased it. Oh, he bought a lot of stuff at Sotheby's in the late 90s. Oh, okay. Well, then maybe he bought it there, and they can find it out. Know where they purchased it. But if they're not clear, or when we were traveling in China, our tour guide, his brother, just so happens to have his antique shop, and we got some really rare Ming cloisonné. Like, oh, okay, you know.
So where did they purchase it? And also,
some of you may have seen, or hopefully if you purchase work, you might not have gotten it, a COA, or a certificate of authenticity, or dealer appraisal, are the worst. There are great certificates of authenticity. We used to also give them one for contemporary work. The case of the Ju Ming and the Zhangwan, you know, we had a certificate of authenticity signed by the artist saying, yes, this is mine, you know, contemporary, it's fine. But we'll get ones that, I think I have an example here. This is a recent one. Well, I didn't redact the name because that person doesn't really exist. I can find. This piece of jade, it's impressive, Qing quality hand-carved sculpture, spectacular pink jade, and you know, it's odd wording, a lot of information all about jade and the symbolization, but nothing about the actual work. No testing, no nothing. We value this to be $85,000.
in a good situation, the client or the owner has this piece of paper because they bought the piece for $10,000, and the dealer's like, I'll sweeten the deal. Look, the original appraisal was this, so you're getting a deal. The bad situation is the client actually paid $85,000 for this, and it's a dealer appraisal. And they say, oh, I had this recently. This was appraised when I bought it. Okay, let me see the documentation. See a lot of these. Usually the independent appraisers are somebody with the gallery, or it's amazing that people don't exist. There was one I couldn't find information on a gallery. I just happened to be in Naples. It turned out they didn't really cheat the guy, so it's fine. Not really cheat him, but I had to do a Google Street View search to find the place, and it was in a strip mall. And he had bought I think it was a $20,000 sculpture there. You know, the guy has bronze frogs outside. It's a red flag. It didn't definitively say, but it's a red flag. And this guy had a whole bunch of certificates of appraisal, $120,000. Again, I didn't redact the name because I can't find anything about this guy. He doesn't exist. There are a lot of Robert F. traps and some people with gemologic, no digital footprint at all. No email that I can find, no business attached to, nothing. The people I did find may not be him at all. Yes?
When you do your searches on, let's say there are web traps, do you use just general Google searches, all that, or do you use proprietary software like LexisNexis or Westlaw?
I don't use LexisNexis. Usually if it's, I haven't needed to, because I'm not going too historical in a sense, or too deep. But usually if I'm looking for somebody who is presenting themselves as an appraiser and I have to go to some sort of proprietary, then there's something fishy, because that's his business. And this is a recent one. This is done 2013. So if he doesn't have a digital, any sort of footprint, not even in the phone books, there's nothing around, nothing. Then I don't, that's already a red flag. This wasn't definitive. This is just the red flags. So no, I haven't needed to use any proprietary people search software. Not for this purposes, for other purposes I did when there's some stolen stuff, but not for just generally trying to find information.
In this case, if that's the ISA, you could probably go to their website and just look up, find an appraiser, and if there's no...
The only place his name was there.
His name was there?
His name was there in a cached file, and it was listed as something totally different.
Oh, interesting.
And all the contact information no longer worked. So that was it. That's right. I remember now. That was it.
Wow.
And he's putting himself out there recently as an appraiser for all of this work. And this was like one of 30 that I had his name on. So again, does this mean anything? It means nothing. I'd rather not see it But unfortunately, this can make the conversation more difficult when it comes. It's a real piece. This is authentic. It was authentic coral, beautiful piece, worth good value, not you know.
Not that good.
No, my gosh, no. That's like 10 times more than that's a factor of 10 what it was worth. However, I had to have that conversation with the owner. He bought them at, this is a punchline of a joke. He bought all this stuff at a gallery in a casino in Las Vegas. So you don't want to, it's not a place of bargain hunt, but I'm talking about retail. And I actually know the retailer who sells this gallery a lot of jade. And she says, I sell to them full retail and they triple it. So it wasn't a good conversation. This is great for contemporary work. I can get anything I want registered for $10. And it still exists today. I was on it the other day. We read very carefully and they say, you know, it's mainly for artists to register their work, which is fine if they have trouble with galleries. But I have seen a few of these things, National Fine Arts title registration for contemporary work, and it really means nothing. It's nothing. I would rather, like you said, no information is better than this information, because then that seems to be an intent to deceive. Okay, I want to get into, I know we're running late, but I want to get into a few fun things, some practical tricks. I always hear this. My father was given this in China years ago. He said it was very valuable. I have no idea. He said it was really valuable. We get that a lot. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. I think we're running a little late. Is that okay with everybody online? And
I think there's only Chris online right now, so.
Okay. Everybody else okay if we spend a few more minutes? Okay. I have no social life, so that's good. But I wanted a few tips and tricks, only because none of this stuff is definitive. None of the stuff talk about the CYA. None of the stuff I'm going to be signing off on. If you do this, it's yes, and do this, it's no. But these are some things if you're approaching a collection, whether it's to purchase at an antique store, whether it's at an auction house, even a reputable one, if you're going to view work, or if you're appraising something, or if you're taking something in like it says collateral, these are some tips and tricks, and they're all going to be about Chinese work because I can't do everything. So first of all, why the difficulty in China? Big and old. What they say America is very, very big but really young. Europe is really, really small but really, really old. China is big and old. Teaching class on the Chinese art right now, and I'm just at the point where BCE turns into CE, and it's taking forever. It's very big and very old. China is also very, very, very prolific. There are painters, contemporary or modern painters, who have put Picasso to shame. Thousands of paintings that are legitimately done by them. Bronzes, porcelain. And China is Chinese. So you have to deal with language. You have to deal with the language of business over there, the language of fakes and honorifics. Yes, I copied their signature precisely. And that's to honor that artist. If you happen to buy it thinking it's that artist, that's up to you. But I didn't mean to deceive. Things like that. I do have these. I can give them out if you want. A lot of, when it comes to Chinese art, incredibly learned people, masters of industry and science and art, they feel foolish when they have to call me up at the one gallery and try to pronounce Wang Guangyi or, Gu Wenda or Zhang Dali, like and they feel foolish. And if you're presenting yourself as any sort of authority, it's good to know a little bit of pinyin. So I gave this, I'll hand it out before we leave, and I can put it online somehow.
Yeah, I can share it.
And you can share it, but it's kind of a cheat sheet on basic pronunciation. If you have to pronounce an artist's name and you don't want to feel foolish, I can give that out. My own version of pinyin, like B-O is bois. I think of like my friends on Long Island say coffee. Bois. It's not bo, it's not bo, ba. So anyways, hopefully that'll help. So prolific. Yeah, tons and tons of stuff, obviously. Bronzes, multiples and multiples in per tomb. So you don't have a lot of, it's tricky valuing because you just don't have a lot of people. Okay, what's hot? See a lot of ceramics, jade, bronze, to some extent, ivory, sadly, coral, and of course painting and calligraphy. I'm just keeping that last. Always, like I said before, look at the context of the collection. Know who you're dealing with. You can waste a lot of unnecessary time by researching every single piece and finding it was all bought at like, what's that place called? Gumps or something that deals a lot of like new Chinese stuff. It's like an online, is that the name? Gumps or something?
Yeah, in San Francisco.
Yeah. I get a lot of stuff. There's a mark on the bottom. Yeah, the mark says Gumps. It's not, not a Gumps dynasty. Find out the history. Was it pre-1911? There's a rule. It's not really followed that much. If it's dynastic, if it's pre-Republic period, there usually has to be paperwork if it came out of China. Sometimes they don't really often follow that anymore. I don't even know if that's, but that does come up. So look at the object. You're most likely to find in ceramics, blue and white type of porcelains, enameled porcelains, terracotta, fat ladies and horses and camels, which you're going to see. Is it porcelain? Which one's Chinese? Even I'm having it.
The left.
This is Chinese. This is
Spanish?
Dutch.
Oh.
Delft, tap it, it's not porcelain. They were copied. Actually, it's funny, they kind of were, some ways they're almost copying each other at one point. But when this is before they're both actually the same age. They're like, I think, 15th century, roughly the same size, same age. They look the same. Colors are slightly different, which is a clue. But, people say I have a great collection of Chinese porcelain. It turns out it's Dutch stuff. Overall shape and quality. I'm just going to go through all these. Is the painting stamped? Get into that. We have bowls. We use it for dinner. And they're like Chinese blue and white bowls. But you can tell, obviously, that the dragon and everything on it was stamped. It's a stamp design, not hand painted. It seems obvious, but then I realized that's not obvious to people who aren't aware that that's a way to tell. People think that there's something that's hand painted and it's stamped. That's a huge red flag. Very nice, but it's $30. Look at the color. I'll get into that. The color is Chinese porcelain. Early on, it was a darker blue, very early, around the 12th century or so, and then it kind of became light, and then it became darker again. Sometimes you can help date. If you get to know Chinese porcelain and study a little bit about it, something you could tell whether or not this is really Ming Dynasty or this is, 1920s. Sometimes it's just the color of the blue. But be aware of that. So when you're photographing something, make sure you have good color, things like that. How is the surface? Okay, we'll get into that. Know your shapes. A lot of people say you could tell by the shapes, even though they're making shapes, every shape now, but the farther back you go, you don't see certain shapes until after a certain time period. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to tell. I can't even really tell, and I've done it for a long time. I still have to kind of do a little research. But if something doesn't feel right or feels clunky, if the shape looks odd, it's a red flag. With earlier porcelain, see how this doesn't sit well? It's kind of warped. This is an extreme example I found for you. But rare that you're going to see is old, 14th century, 15th century bowl that perfectly flush. You put it on a table, perfectly flush. That's a huge red flag. Mm-hmm. Because of this, the process, the type of clay, the way they fired it, it never happens. You always, get down, okay, make sure there's a little warp. Doesn't mean it's real, but it's a good way to kind of gauge where you're going to go next. There's something called orange peel. You see this a lot in like 17th century, 18th century. Very hard to see. It's hard to photograph, but there's a little wrinkling, usually South Chinese pieces. It's not bad. It's not like, oh, that's a misfiring, so it must be inexpensive. It's actually, in many cases, that's what they were looking for. Just so you know, when you see this weird orange peel, note it.
Kind of like porcelain cellulite.
Yes, that's a perfect way. I'm going to steal that. Thank you. Porcelain cellulite. That's perfect. So cellulite is good here. Yeah. Yes.
One thing I want to add in a red flag for me is when you see lots of little black dots in the glaze, that usually means it's been fired a second time because someone's added additional overglaze decoration.
Right. The surface can be. Well, it's good. There can be surface imperfections. There are certain time periods, especially between like the Ming and the Qing transitional period, when work was, the quality really went down. You see a lot of surface imperfections, a lot of little pinholes or pig bristle dots and iron leaching out, or the glaze is not working because somebody wasn't careful. There was very little oversight around a certain period, and you see a lot of bad work. But also, if something was very large or has a rain mark that's supposed to be for an imperial, and there's a lot of little imperfections, it would have never made it out of that workshop. It would have been smashed. So that's a good way to, of course, that rain mark could be totally wrong. In that case, it could still be very valuable, but it's not what you think it is. Sometimes they fake dirty. This is I'm sorry, bad images, obviously from the internet. It looks better on my computer. I don't know, maybe the resolution is bad here. You can literally, don't do this at a client's house or something like that, but you can literally clean a piece, wipe it. Oh, all the dirt just comes right off. All that staining comes right off. So that was artificial. It's a telltale sign. Usually you don't see it that much. Sometimes, some people really rely on rain marks. Rain marks, R-E-I-G-N, spell that right? Dynastic marks. Everybody says, don't rely on these too much, and you shouldn't. So, but sometimes when you talk about refiring, sometimes they'll paint it, put a little clear glaze, and low fire it real quick. You can see a difference. Sometimes the color's bad or the handwriting's bad. So these are just red flags right away. Repairs. Repairs are okay. They're good, especially older repairs, because that means that it had a history enough and it was valuable enough to somebody that they actually took the time to repair it. Japanese pottery, sometimes it's a tradition. I forget the word in Japanese. Kitisui or something. They actually highlight the repairs with gold. It's a way to kind of respect the piece, which I love. I love that they're respecting the piece. But sometimes you'll see piece. Now, is it increase value or decrease value? Usually decrease, but it at least can help you authenticate it, because nobody's going to try to repair a piece that they got in the 1980s with big copper staples. Rain marks. This is an entire lesson in itself. I'm not going to get into it. Handwritten ones, stamps. There's great resources online that can compare. Type it in Chinese rain marks or porcelain marks. You'll find a ton of different sources that can compare. And there's disputes. I'm at a crossroads now where I'm trying to dispute, is this one's real or not? But if you see something, they're both kind of Qianlong, I'm missing here, a certain type of period, which is very, very popular. This is stamped. Anything stamped, and again, some people don't realize that they're stamped because they don't know to look for that. They just see a ring, boom. If you look closely, you say, oh yeah, it's stamped. Anything stamped is pretty much going to be, 20th century. Maybe a little bit earlier, but rarely. 20th century, anything stamped is 20th century. So no matter what it says in that stamp, it's contemporary. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's not valuable, but, and just because they're putting a Qianlong stamp on here doesn't mean they're trying to cheat you. It's a very common practice that they would often put on, even way back when, they would put on they would put on marks from earlier time periods as an honorific. But no. You'll see a lot of these things, these little wax seals. Rarely do you see the stamp. These little wax seals, these are called jending. It used to be when you had still to this day, when you buy an actual antique, it's 100 years older, it has to be approved for export. And the different local branch of whatever government this was, customs government, would stamp it. You can actually research these and find out where they came from. They'd stamp it, and then it was legal. So use furniture, ceramics, other things. And then you could buy them, say, in Hong Kong. Of course, this makes great sense. So if I'm making fake artwork, I'd make fake stamps. So I bought it, like, oh, well, this must be 100 years old because there's a stamp on it. So case closed. So be aware, catalog it, get information on it, but be aware these don't necessarily mean anything. So usually when I see these on something, it's low quality. It's rarely is attached to a super high quality piece, in my experience. Some things are just connoisseurship. Get to know, but it's not difficult. Get to know it. This terrible image, sorry. Blanc de Chine, you'll see a lot of this stuff. It's all white porcelain. It's very popular. It can be very expensive. This piece is incredibly expensive. Terrible. I'm sorry. It is very sharp, clean, kind of a yellowish, almost type of yellowish or even pinkish type of white. Beautiful. This is one that's very contemporary. The quality just isn't there. And it's okay to go with a hunch. Don't base anything on it, but follow your hunch. It doesn't feel like good quality. You're probably right, but confirm it. Super bright white, that's usually contemporary. First thing I do when they take a picture of blank machine, I say, photograph the bottom carefully. They were not slip cast. Slip cast means you pour the liquid in a mold and take it out, and then you can work on it. It's beautiful works. These were hand molded, original. This was besides the property of China, but sometimes it doesn't have that. Right away, you could tell if something is slip cast or not. That'll save you a lot of time. This is a genuine horse. This is what I'm working on now. This is a genuine Tang Dynasty horse. I said look for little drill marks underneath. This actually wasn't, when I enhanced the photograph, it actually was not a drill mark, but sometimes they're under the chin, under here. Those are evidence of thermoluminescence testing. So one time this piece was thermoluminescence. It was tested, and I saw those, and they talked to the client, oh yeah, there was something done, and they found the report. So much easier. And it was tested correctly, and the piece looks good overall. Here's another piece. They tested it. Flying colors. Tang Dynasty. But it's heavy and awkward. Turns out they found a whole bunch of Tang Dynasty bricks, which are everywhere. They're not valuable. They carved the piece out of brick.
Oh, wow.
So when you drilled holes into it, it's Tang Dynasty. It's still ceramic. It's still kind of a terracotta stoneware thing. It's going to register as that. And if that's as far as you went, if you didn't know anything else, there's a lot of tricks. They can use broken pieces and put it together. If the horse feels clunky, photograph everything. Sometimes the glaze, you see these Sans High, these like multicolored little ladies, I have a picture of one. They look dirty. They're going to look a little dirty if they're really old, but they're not going to be dirty. If you can, do this and wipe away dirt, it probably didn't get all the way to your hands, from 1,000 years ago without having that wiped off. So you'll see tiny little cracks. You'll see almost a salty appearance. Be careful, lick it when nobody's looking. Sometimes it is salt. Sometimes you do put like dry out salt water on it to give that kind of weird salty appearance. You don't see it there often because it's, these are like at like the cheap shops overseas. This is a piece, look how beautifully white that is. That's not the clay they would have used. Reddish or grayish, depending on what you're looking at. Another thing, which is that beautiful little fat lady. Tang Dynasty. Actually, really beautiful piece, really fun. Painting was a little too sharp. The dirt was all wrong. But look how crisp and sharp that is. That wouldn't have been buried for 1,000 years plus and handled around it. That crisp and sharp. Right away, you can hold on and say, oh yeah, that's not old. Save you a lot of work. Sometimes they look really, this one looked bad to begin with. But, and here's a factory that makes that. Legitimately, you can buy for about $30. Legitimately, what people do with them after they buy them, they're made to look real, deliberately for the client. I would love to get one. I buy fake bronze a lot. Speaking of, you can see mirrors, burners. Is it bronze? I bring a magnet with me. Sometimes, only because some other, not Chinese, but sometimes iron can be hard to tell the difference between bronze when it's that old. I'll bring a little thing. Is it sound? Usually good bronze, even antique bronze, has a good sound to it, especially if it's something that's a mirror. Cheaper bronze or later bronze sometimes cannot have it's going to be awkward. One bit of that information, don't base much on it. Is the shape decoration right? This comes with study. Is it too light or too heavy? Sometimes really heavy is depending on what time period it was, is bad. Sometimes really light is bad. Is the patina correct? Tons of books on it. If the patina flakes and chips off, it's probably not real. The patina has been developing over thousands of years. It's going to be set on there. And especially if you pick off a piece of patina and you see nice shiny bronze underneath there, it's not it. Mold lines. This is a piece. It was actually sold. It's on sale. If you look really carefully, it does say replica somewhere, but it's obviously a fake. But it does say replica, but there are other places that don't say replica. They don't give an age. They talk about the history of bronze, and this little thing is $2,000 reduced, but it's not $2,000. Hopefully nobody bought this as yours. Sometimes it's quite easy to tell. This piece, friends and I were just examining in the St. Louis Museum. Beautiful piece. It's fake. This is real. The color's a little garish here, but it's not as bright in real life. This very flaky. It feels wrong. So know that this stuff exists. This is my mirror at home, actually. Can't really see that some of the things I actually weld mark on the back. See a sloppy weld mark. They didn't do that back in the Han. Oops. Things don't line up correctly. They're not perfect. Yes.
I just wanted to add one comment about the paint is there's a specific layering that all those colors are supposed to come in. The red and the black are cuprite and tannerite. Those should come first, and then the malachite and anhydrite, the blues and the greens. And so if you see things out of order, that's a problem.
Right, and that's information you can find. Also, sometimes you can see really bright blue. Chances are it'll probably be on the inside because of the way science.
I have a question. So is that because of the like stylistic protocols of the time, or is that because of the chemical composition of the pigments?
It's actually because of the chemical composition of the environment that the object has been stored in.
I see.
But when these were made, they were bronze colored.
Mm-hmm.
They were goldy, colored. Sometimes they were evidence of something painted, but no, all the color was what we see. There has been evidence of faking patinas, hundreds and hundreds of years ago because they like the look. But and there's X-rays you can do. Mold, things don't match up correctly. Sometimes, if you're really lucky, you could see these little tiny. These are perfectly visible, called chaplets. When you cast bronze, and this is like Shang Dynasty way back when. They're little spacers. If it doesn't have those there, sometimes you can only see them in X-rays, then it's fake. That's definitive. If it doesn't have it, it's fake. Unless it's later on when they did other types of casting. This is a piece that was real, and they're just welding it together. It was in the factory. It was unclear what's going to be done with it, and if it was authorized to be repaired in such a way, or it was they were welding it and sell it as, who knows. But a lot of these things are damaged. And this is a very rare piece. Actually, this is an artist of mine. I always think it's funny. They're bronze McDonald's containers. I didn't show them. When I ran a gallery, I used to have these at the gallery. We never sold them. I used to bring them and pass them around. And it's sometimes this would fool people, and then you see the big McDonald's on it too.
It's like a riff on the Ai Weiwei Coca-Cola.
Yes. Yeah.
Emblazoned.
Oh, I should have had that one too. Real quick, ivory, very problematic, but at least it's easy to tell if it's ivory. It could be bone or it could be something totally else. Are there bubbles in the surface? Then it's not ivory or bone. It's some sort of plasticky material or some flashing, like was it cast in a mold. Schreger lines, that's the next slide. Is there a nice patina on it? Really old ivory sometimes has a little bit of yellowish patina. Sometimes they lacquer it or cover it to make it look a little old. If they rub black into it, which is not bad, it doesn't mean it's not ivory, but it might try to fake an age. If it's spotted, I'll show you a picture, that usually means it's bone. These are ivory. See, they kind of rub the little, this is what you'll see a lot, these little figures. Pieces of ivory, these are actually each solid piece. It's a little squished, but bone, usually when you see bone, handles and things, sometimes sections of bone, there's dark brown or black little dots, there's stretched marks all over it. Usually that's a good indication that it's bone and you're fine with whatever it is. Not as pretty. Ivory can be beautifully pure white. It is a gorgeous material, sad where they get it from, of course, but it is a gorgeous material to work with. Schreger lines. These little lines, you'll see them on ivory. Sometimes they're faked on old flatware. They'll fake the lines because the ivory was with Bakelite or something like that, they would fake them. But if you'll see these lines, this is obviously a raw piece of ivory. Know that they exist. Look for them, and if you can even measure them in the future to find out if they're actually mammoth ivory, which is a little less restricted, or elephant ivory. And because they get a lot of mammoth ivory out of Russia up in the steppes, they dig things up.
Is it because mammoth is not just endangered but no longer exists? No
longer exists. I know, and yet there's still huge restrictions. Like it's gonna, I don't know. Here's a piece. It's very beautiful, relatively new, expensive. But you can see in certain areas, you can see where the Schreger lines are. You have to really sometimes look hard for a piece. So find them if you can. Coral, you're going to see these little figures coming out of China usually. Again, bubbles, anything else. Is it relatively heavy? Coral should be a lot heavier than most even stone sometimes. It's very dense. The colors can be everything from whitish to really rich red, but usually the colors are often uneven. You see some little weird spots and things like that. That's a good sign. If you see a perfectly smooth color, there might be dyed or something else. Really, it's about the craftsmanship too. You can heat up a pin and stick it in it, but you don't want to do that to a client's work. You can do a spectrometry test. You can test whether it's real coral or not if you can have access to it. Basically, if it's not plastic, there's a good chance it's coral. There's a few minerals, but it's all about craftsmanship. But if you see something that's plastic, you see a lot of beads and things like that. Yes.
Sorry, maybe we should move to Q&A, and
Okay.
maybe we can have another.
Let's move to
this
Q&A.
was
Sorry,
so great.
I
Maybe we
get off
can
track.
have another. No,
Sounds good.
To me, I think it's wonderful. Maybe we can have another session focusing on.
Yes,
on
thank you
the
for keeping me on track.
materials.
I didn't have time to actually practice the talk, and nobody in my family wants to listen to me talk. So I got a little bit carried away. Well, hopefully, some tips and tricks here, but hopefully we kind of have a different look at authenticity, a little bit more than just material, age, and attribution. You have to really pay attention to everything, history, ownership. Those are the issues that you have to be aware of before you enter blindly into something. So, any questions?
Just a quick one, short change my ignorance. Is there the issue with the East Asian art and Chinese art from the 30s and 40s as there is with the European art?
What issue
I
specifically?
mean, as far as provenance and all that, as with all the Sino-Japanese war?
Not necessarily. There is a case where people are, there was not as much anymore. There's kind of a repatriation where they're spending lots of money trying to get works that went overseas for a variety of reasons. More the Cultural Revolution was almost more devastating than the previous war. But they're nowhere near the extent that what you see in Europe. But there are some instances, but usually not, and they deal with it just by putting it up on the market and buying it. So, you had a question too?
Yes, I run across a number of Chinese objects that are what I would call marriages. And so I had one set of basically grave goods. They were
Right.
bronzes that I'm 100% certain that Han bronzes, that they were correct. They had the textile pseudomorphs that you would expect to see in the corrosion and everything. But somebody had enhanced the small residue of paint that
Yeah.
would have been on the
I hate
bronzes.
that.
And then, I mean, what do you do? Would you take that to a conservator to have that removed, or?
That would be a situation where if everything else checked out, and what she's talking about is you do have an authentic piece. And I've seen this with bronze. I've even seen this with speaking of Han porcelain, even some Neolithic porcelain, where it's real, it's actual, but they didn't think it looked good enough. So then they went back in with paint, or sometimes they did it really, really well. But what do you do? I think if you can see past that and give a definitive authenticity, for most cases, that's kind of the end of the job. Other than telling the client or whoever, you can take it to a conservator. I mean, usually for something like bronze, or even these Han Dynasty, these tomb goods, these terracotta horses, you can wash them, especially some of the ones that were glazed or no paint. You can literally just soak them in water. That's one of the ways to test. You can soak it in water, and as the air gets pushed out, if it smells really nasty, that's a good chance it might be really, really old. But you can clean a lot of the stuff. But I have seen works at auction. If you look carefully at the things, it'll say something like different houses have a different way to say it nicely. Something like, retouched or something like that. What they're saying is it's real, but some idiot, added a little gold to it or enhanced the green or, whatever. Took a Brillo pad to it. I don't know. But yes, in specific cases, I would take it to a conservator and see what that conservator says. Something that's where the material is stable. I would do it with materials not, and if it's going to really, really affect the price, I might not. Something like jades, some lesser quality jades,
or even other stones can be dyed, and there's not much you can do with that. Sometimes they put really heavy wax on them. You can take that off. But yes, I would always seek to try to bring something back to its original state as long as the material is stable. But talk to somebody, talk to a conservator, and they're around. There's a couple really good people, even in this part of the country, who work with jades and terracotta, repairing and putting things back. But make sure you get a good record of it. So, good question. Yes.
I want to know, do you have any suggestion for nowadays? For example, use the new internet technology to build a platform to about the authenticity. For instance, if like Google Art will do like a lot of things in this area, what do you suggest? If Google Art will build a platform for all of the, because for instance, for all of the auction house sale, you actually can put out all of the record,
right.
The sales, the provenance, the condition report. But for the like private dealer sale, you can get the information. Right. Do you have any like suggestion?
Yeah, I usually give them my card and a bill. No, that is trouble. And actually, this question has come up in other talks and in other things. When is there some sort of database? Yes, you can go back to auction houses. And like I said, sometimes it's the market that kind of proves or at least establishes authenticity. And sometimes that's very helpful, very useful. Other times it's not. A lot of things have gone at auction before they knew certain tests or before they knew things. And there's a lot of fake things that have gone through Sotheby's or Christie's or Bond several times over the past, how many dozen years. But there is not often some sort of database. In, for instance, specific areas like ukiyo-e prints, Japanese woodblock prints, there's some really great kind of fan-run databases which can really help, but that's a very specific thing. There are talks now with like blockchain technology that once a piece is established, there might be able to link it to some indelible record. So in the future, if I would put this Han piece up for sale at auction next to another Han piece, I see this has a TL test, but it also has this extra little thing which could enhance value because it increases, lowers the risk or increases confidence in the piece. But unfortunately, there really is no database because so often it is fluid. We're not exactly, sometimes we can't know for sure. It's a consensus of opinion whether something is real. And once you put it in a database, I don't want to be one of those names in the database. Does that make sense?
I think if people want, like, if the database build up and everyone will be one, if there's a lot of real things there and
right.
People will try to do everything to put their things in.
There will be pushback. However, a lot of people make a lot of money because of questionable authenticity, even some very large names. So sometimes I think being upfront and being transparent is great for everybody in the long run. However, in the short run, it can be disruptive. It can be and often unwanted, sadly. So, but that is good. I'm hard with antiquities, with more contemporary and modern work.